The word hit Pauline Sawyer like a slap across the face, sharp and without warning, cutting through the dusty afternoon air of the Underwood ranch yard. Hired hand. She stood perfectly still, her leather medicine bag hanging from her left fist, her right hand still stained with the copper rust of dried blood from the gash she had spent the better part of 2 hours closing on Clem Harker's forearm. The suturing needle was still tucked behind her ear. 17 stitches. Clean work. The kind of work a surgeon in St. Louis would have charged $40 to perform, and she had done it in a barn with lamp oil, silk thread, and a steady hand that never once trembled. And Phineas Underwood, standing 6 feet and 3 inches of broad-shouldered, square-jawed, sun-bronzed rancher, had just introduced her to the circuit banker, Amos Fielding, with those 2 words like they were the whole of her. Hired hand. Fielding had tipped his hat with a greasy sort of politeness and returned to talking numbers with Phineas, and the 2 men had walked back toward the house as though Pauline were part of the fence post, part of the yard, part of the property that got tallied in ledgers. She did not move for a full 10 seconds. She counted them in her head because counting was something she could control, and right now the hot pressure building behind her sternum felt very much like something she could not. She had delivered a calf at 2 in the morning 3 weeks ago, lying on her back in the mud with her arm buried to the elbow in a heifer's birth canal, turning the calf's head so it could come out alive. She had pulled a rotten molar from the mouth of a cowhand named Diego without any anesthetic beyond a belt of whiskey and the man's own white-knuckled determination, using forceps she had ordered from a catalog out of Chicago. She had ridden 14 miles in a December sleet storm to reach a neighboring homesteader's boy who had a fever so high he was seeing things that were not there, and she had brought the fever down using willow bark tea and cold compresses and sheer refusal to let the child die. And she was a hired hand. The betrayal of it was not simple. It was not the clean kind, the kind you could point to and name and then be done with. It was the complicated kind, the kind that sat at the center of something she had not yet admitted to herself fully, something hidden and warm and frightening, that she had been keeping very carefully behind the professional face she wore on this ranch every single day. She had let herself believe, somewhere in the private rooms of her heart she had not given anyone else a key to, that Phineas Underwood saw her differently, that when he looked at her across the supper table with those dark, careful eyes, he was seeing something more. She had been wrong. She turned and walked toward the bunkhouse to wash her hands, and the dust swirled up behind her boots like it was trying to erase her footsteps before she had even finished making them. That was the moment everything cracked open. But to understand what cracked, you had to understand what had been built, and that took going back to the beginning, back to the October of 1882 when Pauline Sawyer arrived in Dry Creek, Texas with a carpetbag, a medical kit, and absolutely nothing else except the particular brand of stubbornness that had kept her alive through things that should have broken her long before she ever set foot in this red dirt country. She had been born in Kentucky in 1854, the second daughter of a country doctor named Edgar Sawyer who believed, against all conventional wisdom of his era, that women were capable of learning medicine just as well as men. He had taught her before she could reach the top of his instrument cabinet without a stool. He had drilled her on anatomy and herbal medicine, and the mechanics of childbirth, and the identification of infection, the same way other fathers drilled their sons on crop rotation and animal husbandry. He had died of a stroke when Pauline was 22, and she had been left with his black bag, his books, and the cold hard knowledge that no formal medical college would admit her and no established physician would take her on as a partner, because she was a woman in 1876 and the world had very settled opinions about that. She had done what she could. She had moved west because the West had a different relationship with necessity than the East did. Out here, if you could do a thing and nobody else could do it better, they would generally let you do it. She had worked in mining camps in Colorado and cattle towns in Kansas, building a reputation that traveled faster than she did, a reputation for being fearless and precise and remarkably hard to rattle. She did not speak much about the years before she came to Dry Creek. There were dark patches in those years. A marriage in Colorado that had been a forced choice more than a free one. A man named Gerald Marsh who had seemed like safety and turned out to be a different kind of danger. A man with secrets so layered and dark that by the time she understood what she had walked into, extracting herself had cost her everything she had managed to accumulate and left a scar on her left forearm that she always kept covered. Gerald Marsh was dead now. He had drunk himself to death in Denver in 1880, and she had learned about it from a newspaper clipping that a traveling merchant had used as packing material around a glass bottle. And she had felt, reading those 3 lines of newsprint, a complicated kind of relief that she had never once let herself express out loud. She had arrived in Dry Creek with $47 and a letter of introduction from a reverend in Kansas who said she was a capable woman of good character. That letter had gotten her a room at the boarding house run by Martha Clegg, who was a practical woman and did not spend much time on social convention when practicality was available. The Underwood Ranch was 4 miles outside of town, and it was a significant operation. Phineas Underwood ran 1,200 head of cattle across 6,000 acres of land that had been in his family since before the war. He was 33 years old in 1882, which was 6 years older than Pauline, a gap that seemed practically invisible once you placed them in the same room and discovered they were both the particular kind of person who had learned early that life did not hand you things, and that waiting for rescue was a trap. His wife had died 4 years earlier in 1878 of a fever that swept through the county and took 11 people in 3 weeks. Her name had been Clara, and by all accounts she had been a gentle woman, a kind woman, a woman who had been thoroughly loved and who had left a hole in the ranch, and in the man running it that was still visible if you knew how to look. He had 2 daughters, Margaret who was 8 and Frances who was 6 when Pauline arrived, and they were being raised by a housekeeper named Bertie Nash who was 60 years old, and moved through the ranch house with the patient authority of someone who had been doing important work for a very long time and intended to keep doing it. Pauline's first contact with the Underwood Ranch had been professional, which was how all her contacts started. One of the cowhands' horses had thrown him and he had come up with a dislocated shoulder, and someone in town had pointed at Pauline's door and said she was the one to go to. She had reduced the dislocation cleanly, and the cowhand, a man named Tolliver, had told everyone on the Underwood payroll that she was the best he had ever seen work on a human body, and he had seen quite a few people try. Phineas had ridden into town a week later, not to hire her, not at first. To thank her, which was unusual enough that Pauline remembered exactly where she was standing when he walked through her door, which was next to the window where the light was good, grinding dried yarrow into powder for a compressed mixture. He had taken his hat off when he came inside. She noticed that. A lot of men didn't. He was tall in the way that some men in that country were tall, as though the land had stretched him, and his eyes were the deep brown of creek water in autumn, and they moved around her workspace with the particular quality of a man who was actually looking at things rather than performing the act of looking. He took in the organized rows of jars on the shelf, the neat hanging bundles of dried herbs, the row of instruments laid out on the clean cloth by the basin, and his expression was one of genuine attention, which was also unusual. He had said, with a bluntness that she later came to understand was simply his natural mode, that he had not expected her workspace to be so organized. She had said with an equal bluntness that she had not expected the owner of the largest ranch in the county to come to town personally to say thank you for a shoulder reduction. He had almost smiled. Almost. He had stayed for 20 minutes, which stretched in a way that suggested neither of them was quite ready for it to end. And when he left he had said that if she was ever looking for work beyond the town itself, his ranch could use someone with her skills. He had said it practically, without sentiment, as an employer speaking to a prospective employee, and she had accepted it in the same register because that was the safer register, the one that did not involve the particular warm confusion that was already beginning, even that first day, to make itself known somewhere behind her professional composure. She had moved out to the Underwood Ranch in November of 1882, taking a room in the small structure adjacent to the main house that had once been used as a storage room, and had been cleared out and fitted with a cot, a wash basin, and a south-facing window at her request. She had her own lamp, and she worked by it late into most evenings, reading, cataloging, writing up notes on cases in the small leather journals she kept in a locked box under her cot. The cowhands had accepted her with varying degrees of skepticism that dissolved in rough proportion to the number of times she fixed something that was wrong with them. By December, most of them were comfortable enough to knock on her door at odd hours and show her things they were embarrassed to show anyone else, infected fingers and abscesses and injuries they had been hoping would resolve on their own and hadn't. She was efficient and direct, and she never made them feel foolish, which was the fastest possible route to professional trust in that particular population of men. Phineas watched all of this with the quiet observational quality that she was coming to understand was simply how he moved through the world. He managed his operation from a slight distance, seeing everything, commenting selectively, and when he commented it tended to be worth hearing. He was not a man who spoke to fill silence. Silence for him was not something that needed filling. This was both a relief and a complication for Pauline, who was herself not a great talker in most contexts but who, in the context of Phineas Underwood, found herself wanting to say things she hadn't planned. It started with supper. Bertie Nash ran a communal supper table in the main house every evening, which included Phineas, his daughters, Bertie herself, and whoever else happened to be present with legitimate business there. Pauline was invited from her first week. The first several suppers were careful and polite. By the third week something had loosened, not dramatically, not with any single event you could point to, but gradually the way a joint loosens with warmth and movement. Phineas began asking her questions. Not personal questions, not yet. Professional questions. Questions about what she had studied, what she had seen, what treatments she had found reliable, and which ones she considered useless despite their widespread use. He listened to her answers with complete attention, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated he had actually retained what she said. It was, Pauline thought privately, the most intellectually stimulating conversation she had encountered since her father's kitchen table. It was dangerous for exactly that reason. The two girls, Margaret and Frances, were a separate project. Margaret was watchful and a little solemn, the way children become when they have experienced loss before they have any framework for it, and she regarded Pauline with a careful scientific interest that Pauline recognized immediately, because it was very much what she herself must have looked like as a child. Frances was louder and warmer and decided within 2 weeks that Pauline was her personal property in a way that was entirely unauthorized, but also somehow touching. Frances had developed the habit of appearing in Pauline's workroom at unexpected moments and announcing things. She had announced, for example, that Pauline's hair was the same color as the bay mare's mane, and she meant this as the highest possible compliment. She had announced that their father never laughed as much as when Pauline was at supper, which had produced a charged silence at the table that neither adult had known exactly how to exit. She had announced, during a particularly memorable supper in January of 1883, that she thought Pauline should just stay forever, and that this was a much better idea than any other idea anyone had had lately. Phineas had redirected Frances with the patient firmness of a man who had learned the skill of redirecting small children without crushing their enthusiasm, and the conversation had moved on, and Pauline had stared at her plate of beans and cornbread, and told herself very firmly that she was a professional woman with a professional arrangement, and that was the whole of it. The calf delivery happened in February. February in that part of Texas was cold in a way that people from the east tended to underestimate. A damp, biting cold that worked its way through layers and settled in your bones. There had been a heifer that Phineas was concerned about, a young one making her first delivery and struggling. The cowhand with the most experience with livestock births was down with a bad chest cold, and by 2 in the morning it was clear that without intervention the calf and possibly the heifer were going to be lost. Phineas had knocked on Pauline's door with visible reluctance, clearly fighting the instinct to apologize for the hour, and Pauline had been awake because she had heard the sounds from the barn and had been waiting. She had pulled on her heavy coat and her boots and followed him out into the February dark. She did not remember afterward whether she had been cold. She remembered the smell of the barn, hay and animal warmth, and the particular anxiety sweat of a heifer in distress. She remembered the lamp casting orange light over everything. She remembered Phineas standing at the stall entrance with his arms crossed, watching, saying nothing, but present in a way that was somehow steadying rather than intrusive. She had talked to the heifer in a low, continuous murmur while she worked, not words exactly, just sound. A sound that said, "I know what I am doing, and you are going to be all right." The calf's head was turned wrong, creating a blockage that would have made natural delivery impossible. Getting it right required patience and steadiness, and a complete willingness to ignore the fact that her arm was buried to the elbow in a very large, very frightened animal in a cold barn in the middle of the night. The calf had come out after 40 minutes of careful work, wet and shaking and furiously alive. The heifer had been exhausted but intact. Pauline had cleaned up at the pump in the barn and stood breathing the cold air that came under the barn door and felt the particular satisfaction she always felt after a good outcome, which was not pride exactly but something adjacent to it, something clean and solid. Phineas had said, quietly, from where he still stood near the stall entrance, "I have never seen anyone work like that." She had thought he meant efficiently. She had thought he was making an observation about technique. She had not let herself think he might mean anything else, because the trap that waited in that other interpretation was one she was not prepared to walk into. She had said thank you and gone back to her room and lain on her cot staring at the ceiling until the sky went gray with morning. March brought Diego's tooth. Diego Reyes was a cowhand who had been with the Underwood operation for 6 years, and who bore pain with a stoicism so complete it had allowed him to ignore a severely infected molar for 3 weeks longer than any reasonable person should have. By the time he appeared at Pauline's door, his jaw was swollen and his fever was climbing, and the situation was past the point where anything except extraction was going to help him. Pauline had her forceps. She had whiskey. She had a good lamp and a steady hand, and the knowledge that this was going to hurt considerably regardless of what she did to soften it. Diego had taken 2 long pulls from the bottle and sat in the chair Pauline used for procedures and gripped the armrests and said, in Spanish and then in English, that he was ready. It had taken 7 minutes. Clean extraction, no root left behind, which was the most important thing because a fragment left behind would have meant more infection and more trouble. Diego had sat very still throughout, breathing in long, deliberate pulls, and when it was done he had said, with sincere gravity, that she had a gift from God and he meant that completely. Phineas had found out about it, as he found out about most things on his operation, from multiple sources, and at supper that evening he had looked at Pauline across the table with an expression she was becoming familiar with, one that she might have called admiration in any other context, but which she was careful to leave unnamed. He had said, "Diego told me you were fast and sure and never hesitated." She had said that hesitation was the enemy of clean work. He had said, with the almost smile, "I have come to believe that is true in most things." The silence after that had been a different kind of silence from the professional ones. Spring came to the ranch, the way spring came to that part of Texas, sudden and extravagant, green coming up so fast after the brown months that it felt almost aggressive. The work of the ranch intensified with the season, calving and branding, and all the enormous physical labor of managing a large cattle operation through its most demanding period. And Pauline found herself moving through days that were full in a way she had not experienced in years, useful in ways that were both specific and cumulative, embedded in something larger than herself. She began to understand, in that spring, what Phineas had built. Not just the physical scale of it, though that was considerable, but the culture of it. He ran a fair operation. He paid his cowhands on time and in full. He did not permit certain behaviors among his crew that were common on other ranches, the mistreatment of animals, the carrying of personal grudges into the work, the small cruelties that could erode a community if leadership allowed them. The Mexican and Anglo cowhands worked alongside each other without the friction she had seen on other operations, and she understood that this was not an accident. Phineas had deliberately built something with values in it. This was, she thought privately, a revealing thing. A man who built something with values in it rather than just efficiency or profit had a particular kind of moral structure, and she found herself, in the evenings when the work was done, thinking about that structure with an interest that had nothing professional in it. She was in trouble. She knew she was in trouble. The hidden thing she had been keeping behind her professional face was growing too large to stay hidden much longer, and she did not know what to do with it. Her history with Gerald Marsh had taught her, with the thoroughness that only experience can teach, that choosing a man under pressure or loneliness or the need for safety was not choosing at all. It was falling, and the difference between falling and choosing was everything. She had promised herself, after Gerald, that she would never again make a decision about a man from anything other than the clearest part of herself. And the clearest part of herself was telling her that Phineas Underwood was not Gerald Marsh in any conceivable way, but also that the stakes were higher than they had ever been because she had never, not with Gerald, and not with any of the other peripheral men who had moved through the edges of her years, felt anything like this particular feeling. This combination of intellectual compatibility and physical awareness, and a deep bone-level sense that this was someone she could trust, which was the rarest and most frightening feeling she knew. And then came the afternoon with Amos Fielding, and the word that cut everything open: hired hand. She spent the rest of that afternoon in her workroom reorganizing things that did not need reorganizing, which was what she did when she needed to think without appearing to think. She laid out her instruments in a different order. She relabeled 3 of her herb jars. She restocked her suturing supplies from the box she kept under the shelf. She thought about leaving. It was a serious thought, not a dramatic one. She turned it over with the same clinical attention she brought to everything. She had a portable skill set. She had a reputation in the county that would travel with her wherever she went. She could be in another town within a week and building a new professional arrangement shortly after. Dry Creek and the Underwood Ranch were not the only places in Texas that needed someone with her abilities. She could leave, and the ache of it would do what aches did, which was eventually diminish, and she would be a professional woman who had made a professional decision, and that would be the whole story. She was in the middle of this thought when the door opened without a knock, which meant it was Frances. Frances was 7 now, because her birthday had been in April, and she came through the door of Pauline's workroom the same way she did everything, with full forward momentum and no visible hesitation, and she announced that supper was ready, and also that her father had been in a strange mood all afternoon since the banker left, and Bertie said he was thinking hard about something, and that when Papa thought hard about something, it was usually important. Pauline said she would be in for supper in a moment. Frances said that she also wanted to mention that there was apple cake tonight because it was Bertie's birthday. Pauline said that was very good news. Frances went back out the way she came in, and Pauline stood for a moment with her hands flat on the workbench, looking at nothing, and made a decision. Not to leave. Not yet. To say something. She had spent her whole adult life being direct in professional matters and indirect in personal ones, and the contradiction of that had never cost her as much as it was costing her now, and she was tired of the cost. She went to supper. Bertie's apple cake was excellent and received with the appropriate enthusiasm. Margaret read aloud from a book she had been working through, a natural history volume that Pauline had ordered from a catalog in San Antonio and given her as a birthday gift 3 weeks ago. Frances ate 2 pieces of cake and was told that 2 was the established limit. Phineas sat at the head of the table and was, as Frances had reported, in a strange mood, though strange was not precisely the word Pauline would have chosen. He was quieter than usual in a way that was pointed rather than settled. He was turning something over. After supper, after the girls were put to bed and Bertie had retired to her room, Pauline found Phineas on the front porch, which was where he went when he was doing his most concentrated thinking. He was leaning on the railing looking out at the dark yard, and the night was warm for late spring, soft and full of insect sound, and the stars over that part of Texas were the particular overwhelming kind that reminded you regularly that the world was enormous and human concerns were very small. She came out and stood beside him and looked at the same dark yard. He said nothing. She said, "Hired hand." She said it as a statement, not a question or an accusation. She said it the way you name something that has been lurking unnamed for too long. The silence that followed had a specific quality, the quality of something having been placed on a table between 2 people. Phineas turned his head and looked at her. In the starlight his expression was difficult to read but not impossible if you had been paying attention to his face for 6 months, which she had. He said, "Fielding is a man who only recognizes categories." She said, "And what category am I in on this ranch?" The question sat between them. She could feel the weight of it. She had not meant to be so direct so quickly, but the direct version had come out because she was tired of the indirect version and its costs. Phineas turned to face her fully, which was a thing he did when he was saying something he considered important. He said, "You are the most capable person I have ever had working on this property, the most capable person I know of in this county. You pulled Diego's tooth without flinching and delivered a calf in the middle of a February night, and have kept 4 of my hands working at full capacity when they would otherwise have been laid up or worse, and you did all of that with a steadiness I have never seen equaled." He stopped. She waited. He said, "And I called you a hired hand to Fielding because I did not know what else to call you, and I have been thinking about that all afternoon. And the truth is that hired hand is the worst possible description of what you are to this place." The air between them felt very still. She said, because the direct version kept coming, "What am I to this place?" He said quietly. "That is what I have been trying to work out, what it is appropriate to say." "What you would want to hear as opposed to what I might want to say," she said. "What would you want to say?" This was the furthest she had gone. She could feel the ground shifting under the conversation the way she could feel a creek bank starting to give under too much pressure, that particular soft instability that preceded a change in landscape. Phineas was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to be uncomfortable, and then slightly passed it into something else, something different. He said, "I would want to say that there has not been a day in the last 6 months when I have not been glad you were here, not for the medicine, not for the work, though those things matter, but for the company at supper in the evenings, the particular way you see things and say things, and the fact that you never say anything unless you mean it." He paused. "Clara used to say that I was the most difficult man to read in the county, and I believe she was right, and I apologize for being difficult to read now. I'm out of practice saying these things," Pauline said. "I'm out of practice hearing them." He said, "Did you consider leaving after this afternoon?" She said, "Yes." He said, "I would like very much for you not to leave." She said, "That would depend on why." He looked at her in the starlight and said, "Because I am in love with you. That is the plain version of it. I recognize that it is abrupt and that I do not have the vocabulary for it, and that you have every right to tell me it is not what you want to hear, but you asked for what I would want to say, and that is it." The night insects kept singing. The stars kept being enormous. Pauline stood on the front porch of the Underwood ranch with her heart doing something complicated and thorough, and told herself the truth, which was that she had known this was coming because she had been watching it come for months and pretending not to, and that the fear she felt was not fear of Phineas but fear of herself, fear of the part of herself that wanted this so much that the wanting felt dangerous. She said, "I was married before." He said, "I know." She looked at him. He said, "Not the details, just the fact of it. It is a small county," she said. "It was not a good marriage. It was a marriage I made because I thought I needed protection and because I was young enough to believe that the two things, the need and the feeling, were the same thing. They were not," he said. "And now," she said, "now I am old enough to tell the difference. And I am telling you, as plainly as you told me, that what I feel when I am in this place, at your table in your company, is not the same thing. It is entirely different. It is the kind of feeling I did not think I would have the good fortune to encounter, and I am frightened of it in proportion to how much it matters," he said. "I am frightened of it too." Something in his voice when he said that, some unguarded quality, reached right past every carefully maintained professional wall Pauline had constructed and found the real thing underneath. She said, "Then we are two frightened people standing on a porch," he said. "I suppose we are." And then, because the conversation had reached the end of what words could do, there was a moment where the space between them was simply too small, and Phineas reached up and very carefully, with the particular gentleness of a large man who is conscious of his size, touched her face with one hand, and she did not step back. The kiss, when it came, was quiet and careful and thorough, the kind that people arrive at after a long approach, and it tasted of the apple cake and the night, and something that Pauline did not have a medical term for, something that lived in the territory beyond clinical language. When they separated, they stood in the same spot and breathed for a moment. He said, "I need to do this properly," she said. "What does properly look like to you?" he said. "Courtship, formal and appropriate. You deserve that," she said, with the dry quality that was one of her more reliable defenses. "I am 28 years old and a widow, and I have delivered a calf in a February barn. I am not certain formal and appropriate is the precise register." He almost smiled, and then the smile completed itself, which was a thing she had not seen fully before and which was, she thought, one of the genuinely remarkable things she had encountered in her life. He said, "Then perhaps courtship with some practical modifications," she said. "That sounds about right." They stood on the porch a little longer in the soft Texas night, and it was different from the standing on the porch he did alone when he was thinking, because now there were two people thinking in the same direction, which was its own particular kind of warmth. What followed was the best 3 months of Pauline Sawyer's life, which was a statement she did not make lightly given that it was also, in many ways, among the most complicated. The courtship was, as agreed, practical with modifications. It consisted primarily of the natural extension of the things they already did together, the supper conversations and the evening hours on the porch, but with the addition of a quality that had not been present before, an acknowledged quality, an open one. They stopped pretending the conversation was about something other than what it was about. They talked about things they had not talked about before. He told her about Clara, about the particular grief of watching a strong person weaken, and what it had done to the ranch and to the girls and to himself. He told it plainly, without performing sentiment, and she heard in it the same quality she heard in his ranch operations, the honesty of a man who had decided at some point to deal in facts rather than comfortable fictions. She told him about Gerald Marsh, all of it, the forced choice quality of the decision, the way the secrets had revealed themselves in layers, so that by the time she understood the full picture, she was already inside it. The violence that had been occasional and then less occasional, and the morning she had woken up and decided that survival was more important than appearances, and had taken her medicine bag and her father's books, and left while Gerald was still asleep. She told this without inflection, with the same steadiness she brought to the barn at 2 in the morning, and when she was done she looked at Phineas to see what his expression had done with it. His expression had gone to the careful, serious quality she associated with him encountering something he considered important. He said, "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I needed you to know where I came from before we went further. Any hidden thing becomes a trap if it stays hidden long enough." He said, "I agree with that completely." He reached across the table, where they were sitting with the remnants of their evening coffee, and put his hand over hers, and they stayed like that for a while in a silence that was the good kind, the settled kind. The girls watched all of this with different responses that were very true to their characters. Margaret watched it with the analytical quality she brought to all new data, processing and cataloging, and occasionally asking questions that were so direct they startled adults who were not prepared for them. One evening in June, she said to Pauline, very directly, that she hoped Pauline was going to stay permanently because it was better for everyone when she was there. And she said this in the tone she might have used to report the results of an experiment. And Pauline had felt something so warm and sharp simultaneously that she'd had to look at the ceiling for a moment. Frances had simply decided that Pauline was already hers and adjusted her behavior accordingly, which meant including her in all plans automatically and treating any suggestion otherwise with the kind of serene incomprehension that only very young children can fully achieve. The complication came in July. It came in the form of a man named Harlan Boggs, who was the second largest landowner in the county, and who had, before Pauline's arrival, been pursuing his own interest in the Underwood property in a manner that was polite on the surface and predatory underneath. Boggs wanted Underwood land. He had been trying to acquire it through financial pressure, through a mortgage situation that Amos Fielding, who was also Boggs's man it turned out, had been quietly arranging and misrepresenting. Pauline found this out by accident, the way most important things are discovered, not through investigation, but through paying attention at the right moment. She had been in the main house one afternoon looking for a reference book she had left in the parlor, and she had overheard a conversation in the adjoining room between Fielding, who had ridden out ostensibly about paperwork, and one of Boggs's other associates. The conversation was about numbers, about the terms of a loan that Phineas had taken on for equipment improvements the previous year, and the terms being discussed were not the terms that Pauline, who had an excellent memory and had been present at the supper table when Phineas mentioned the loan, understood to be the actual terms. The numbers were wrong in a direction that favored Fielding and Boggs and would put the Underwood operation in breach by November. Pauline stood in the hallway with the reference book in her hand and her heartbeat very loud in her ears and thought about what she was hearing with the same systematic clarity she brought to medical diagnosis. She cataloged what she knew. She identified what she did not know. She identified what she needed to find out. She waited until Fielding left, and then she went and found Phineas in the north pasture where he was checking fence line. And she told him, precisely and without drama, what she had heard. The expression on his face went through several stages quickly, the way faces do when receiving information that reorganizes a significant portion of one's understanding. He asked several questions, the right questions, the questions that confirmed she had heard what she had heard and understood it accurately. Then he was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was thinking hard. He said, "The original loan documents are in the strongbox in the office." She said, "I would look at them carefully, and I would also consult a lawyer who has no connection to Fielding." He said, "There is a man in San Antonio," she said. "I think a trip to San Antonio might be warranted." He said, "Will you come with me?" she said. "Yes." They rode to San Antonio, a 2-day journey by horse and wagon, with Bertie staying at the ranch with the girls. It was the first extended time they had been in each other's company outside the ranch context, and there was something clarifying about travel, about the way the road stripped away the familiar and showed you who a person was when their routines were removed. Phineas was a good traveling companion, attentive and practical and capable of comfortable silence without it feeling like withdrawal. He noticed things on the road that he mentioned briefly and accurately: the quality of a distant herd, the signs of weather building to the west, the tracks of a large animal near a watering hole. She noticed him noticing things and liked it. In San Antonio, the lawyer confirmed what Pauline had suspected. The loan documents Fielding had been presenting publicly contained numbers that had been altered from the originals, which the lawyer compared carefully and declared fraudulent. There was a process for addressing this, a formal legal process, but it required time and documentation and the willingness to bring a formal complaint. The lawyer said it plainly. Boggs had tried this kind of manipulation before with smaller operations, and it had worked because those operations had not caught it in time and had not had access to good legal counsel. Phineas said, without particular heat, he made the mistake of involving someone who pays attention. Pauline understood that the someone was her. She said, "What does this require from you?" he said. "Time, paperwork." The willingness to make an enemy of Boggs formally, which means he will likely make things uncomfortable, she said. "Can you weather that?" he said. "If I know what's coming, yes." The return journey from San Antonio had the quality of something shared. The way going through a difficult thing together builds a kind of understanding that good times alone cannot create. They stopped for the night at a way station that had a respectable enough room situation, Pauline taking the single room available, and Phineas sleeping in the stable at his own insistence. And in the evening they sat outside and talked until the fire they had built burned down to coals. And at some point in the middle of a sentence about something practical, Phineas had stopped talking and looked at her in the firelight and said, "I want to ask you something that I have been trying to work up to for some time." She said, "Ask it," he said. "Will you marry me?" She was quiet for one beat, not from uncertainty but from the impact of it, the way something you have been moving toward still meets you with full force when it finally arrives. She said, "Yes," he said. "I wanted to ask properly, with a ring and a supper and appropriate ceremony. But we are in a way station in the middle of the road and I find I cannot wait any longer." She said, "Phineas, I delivered a calf in a February barn. I am not a woman who requires the ring before the answer." He did the smile, the full one, and it changed everything in his face, the way dawn changes a landscape. And she thought, not for the first time and certainly not for the last, that this man was going to be the best thing that had happened to her life, and that she was going to spend a considerable amount of time being glad of it. They were married in September of 1883 in Dry Creek, in the small church at the center of town, with the entire population of the county apparently in attendance, and a wedding supper that Bertie Nash organized with the same capable authority she brought to everything, and that went on, by Pauline's later count, approximately 2 hours longer than she had expected and was better for it. Margaret had worn a blue dress that matched her eyes and had served as an unofficial scientific observer of the proceedings. Frances had been a flower girl with such thoroughness that the path to the altar was essentially a meadow by the time Pauline walked it. The flowers had been Frances's own selection, gathered from the ranch that morning with a determination that brooked no interference. The ceremony itself was brief and sincere, and when Pauline stood opposite Phineas at the front of the church and he looked at her with those dark autumn eyes, she felt in the most complete possible way that she was choosing, freely and clearly and from the best part of herself, which was the only promise she had made to herself after Gerald Marsh, and the one that mattered most. He had given her a ring that had been his grandmother's, a simple silver band with a small garnet that was old enough to have its own history, and when he put it on her finger it sat there with the settled quality of something that had been waiting to be where it was. Harlan Boggs had not attended the wedding, which was expected, and had spent the months between the discovery of the fraud and the filing of the formal complaint making various kinds of trouble, the kind that stopped short of anything overtly illegal because his own situation was already legally precarious. He had sent a man to talk to some of the Underwood cowhands about opportunities elsewhere, trying to thin the operation's workforce. He had circulated some unflattering claims about the ranch's financial stability to other business connections in the county. He had been, in short, a man determined to create damage without exposing himself to further formal consequences. Phineas had handled it the way he handled most problems, by seeing it clearly and not being panicked by it, and making decisions from a steady position rather than a reactive one. The cowhands who had been approached had, without exception, declined Boggs's overtures and reported the conversations to Phineas directly, which said something about the loyalty that good leadership accumulates over time. The legal complaint moved through its processes with the grinding patience of the law, which was slow but, in this case, thorough. By the spring of 1884, the case had been sufficiently documented and examined that Fielding faced serious professional consequences and Boggs faced formal restitution. He did not lose everything. He was too well connected for that. But he lost enough that he was no longer in a position to threaten the Underwood operation. And more importantly, the attempt had been publicly named and examined in a way that made future attempts considerably less attractive. The county had, in the way of small communities, opinions about all of this, and most of the opinions were favorable to Phineas and to Pauline, whose role in uncovering the scheme was generally known and generally respected, which added a dimension to her already established professional reputation that she had not anticipated but did not mind. Meanwhile, the ranch continued to operate, and Pauline's role in it continued to evolve in ways that interested her. She had never been purely a medical presence on the Underwood operation, and she was certainly not purely that now that she was Pauline Underwood, though she kept Sawyer as a professional name because her reputation was built on it, and because Phineas had said, with characteristic directness, that he saw no reason she should not use the name she had earned. She continued to practice medicine for the ranch community and for the wider county, building a patient base that was, by the standards of that time and place, remarkable, people who rode significant distances to reach her because the word of her competence had traveled further than she had. She also found herself more involved in the operational decisions of the ranch, not because she had sought that role, but because Phineas had a habit of thinking out loud with her in the evenings, and her analytical mind engaged with the problems in ways that he found useful. She knew nothing about cattle ranching when she arrived and knew a great deal more by the spring of 1884, not because she had set out to learn it, but because learning was what she did with new information in her environment. There was a conversation in the fall of 1883, a few months into the marriage, that she remembered afterward as one of the shaping ones. They had been sitting on the front porch, which was the location of most of their most important conversations, and she had said something about a problem she had been working on with a patient, an older man in town whose chronic joint pain she was trying to manage with a combination of approaches she had been developing. And Phineas had listened, and then said something that demonstrated he had been paying attention not just to what she said, but to how she thought. And then she had asked him about a grazing rotation question he had been working through, and he had talked about it, and she had asked a question from left field, from the angle of someone who did not know the conventions and therefore was not constrained by them, and he had stopped mid-sentence and looked at her and said, "That is exactly right, and it is what I was not seeing." She had said, "I do not always know the right question to ask. Sometimes the wrong question accidentally points at the right thing." He had said, "That is a skill more valuable than most people recognize." She had said, "My father taught me to ask questions in the direction of things I did not understand." He said the appearance of understanding is the enemy of actual understanding. Phineas had thought about that and said, "Your father sounds like he was a remarkable man." She had said, "He was." He had the courage to teach his daughter everything he knew in a world that thought it was a waste of time, and that is a particular kind of bravery. They had sat with that for a moment. He had said, "I intend to teach Margaret and Francis everything I know about running this operation. I have been thinking about it for some time. Whatever they want to do with their lives, they should have that foundation." She had looked at him in the soft evening light and thought that she understood why she had recognized something in him from the beginning. Because a man who thought that way about his daughters was a man who held the same fundamental belief as her father, that women's capabilities were something to be developed rather than limited. And that belief, in 1883 in Texas, was not common and was not cheap. She had said, "Margaret will probably ask you questions that you cannot answer. I suggest embracing that rather than finding it uncomfortable." He had said, with full smile, "I have been practicing with you." The first year of marriage taught Pauline things about herself that surprised her, which was itself surprising, given that she had considered herself a reasonably self-aware person. She discovered that she had been carrying a loneliness she had grown so accustomed to that she had stopped noticing its weight, and it was only in the comparative absence of it that she could feel what it had actually cost. The constancy of Phineas, the daily presence of him, his steady, unremarkable reliability, the way he showed up every day as the same person he had been the day before without the volatility that she had been braced against from her history. All of this had an effect on her that she could only describe as an unclenching, some long-held tension releasing from the place she held it. She discovered also that she was good at the domestic dimensions of the life she had entered, which surprised her because she had spent so many years operating entirely in the professional register, that she had assumed the domestic one was a separate country she would never quite be native to. But the ranch house and its rhythms made sense to her, and she found Bertie Nash to be an ally rather than a competitor, a woman who understood immediately and with no drama what Pauline's arrival meant, and who adapted with a grace that made the whole thing considerably easier. Bertie stayed on as housekeeper and cook and the absolute backbone of the household operations, and Pauline brought the medical and analytical dimensions, and the two women developed a partnership and a friendship that was one of the more quietly satisfying things of that first year. The girls settled into the new configuration with different speeds, Margaret requiring approximately 3 months to move from watchful analysis to comfortable belonging, and Francis requiring approximately 3 minutes, which was consistent with their personalities. Margaret, one afternoon in the fall, had come to Pauline's workroom with a bruised knee from a fall, which was not a medical emergency but which she had clearly found a reason to attend to specifically. And while Pauline was cleaning and wrapping it, she had said, without looking up from the book she had brought with her, "My mother would have liked you." Pauline had stayed very steady and said, "That is a kind thing to say." Margaret had said, "It is not kind, it is accurate. My mother liked capable people who did not pretend things. She did not have a great deal of patience for pretending." Pauline had said, "I remember you telling me she was very straightforward." Margaret had said, "Papa is the same way. I think that is why he fell in love with you." Pauline had sat back and looked at this 8-year-old girl with her bandaged knee and her natural history book and her complete lack of social artifice, and she had thought that Margaret Underwood was going to be a force to be reckoned with, and she had felt a complicated and complete love for her that she had not expected to feel so fully so quickly. She had said, "I fell in love with your father too, you know. It was a mutual situation." Margaret had considered this with appropriate scientific seriousness and said, "That is the best kind." The baby question was one that Pauline and Phineas had discussed early and honestly, because they were both people who discuss things early and honestly, and because it was relevant to multiple practical and emotional dimensions of their shared life. Phineas had said that he would be glad of more children if she wanted them and content without if she did not, and he had said it with the sincerity of someone who genuinely meant both halves of the statement. Pauline had said that she had thought she might not, for a long time, not because she did not want children, but because the circumstances in which she had lived had not made it a reasonable hope. But that here, in these circumstances, the question felt different. She had been pregnant by the winter of 1883, which she discovered with the mix of astonishment and clear-eyed practicality that she brought to most significant things. And she had told Phineas one evening at the supper table with no preamble whatsoever, because preamble was not her natural mode. He had looked at her across the table with an expression that went through several things quickly, and arrived at a kind of overwhelmed gladness that he normally would have kept private, but that was too large in that moment to keep private. And he had reached across the table and taken both her hands and held them for a long moment without saying anything. Francis, who was present at the table, had asked with great urgency what was happening. Margaret, who had deduced it, said calmly, "There is going to be a baby." Frances had made a sound of pure delight and fallen slightly out of her chair, which was her response to information that excited her to a threshold she had not anticipated. The baby arrived in August of 1884, in the same ranch where Pauline had delivered the calf 2 years prior, which fact she found, in retrospect, appropriately thematic. He was a boy, healthy and loud, and equipped from the first minute with an opinion about everything. And they named him Edgar, after Pauline's father, which had been Phineas's suggestion, made one evening when they were discussing names, offered simply and without ceremony, and which had produced in Pauline a feeling of being thoroughly known that she had not expected, and that had required her to look out the window for a moment before she could respond. Bertie had delivered the baby because Pauline was not in a position to deliver her own child, and because Bertie had delivered children before and was competent and unflappable, and Phineas had been in the room in a way that was unusual for the era, but which nobody on the Underwood ranch was inclined to challenge, because it was his house, and his wife, and his particular understanding of what being present in the important moments required. Afterward, when it was quiet and Bertie had taken the very opinionated Edgar to wash him, Phineas had sat on the edge of the bed and looked at Pauline in a way that contained things that did not have words available, and Pauline, who was exhausted and satisfied and in the particular state of emotional transparency that follows very significant physical events, had looked back at him and said, "Thank you for being here," he had said. "There is nowhere else I would be," she had said. "I know. That is part of what I am thanking you for, that it is so completely obvious that this is where you would be." He had held her hand, and they had listened to Edgar's first serious conversation with the world, which he was conducting at considerable volume in the adjoining room. The years that followed were the years of building, which is the quietest and most significant work of a life. Pauline expanded her medical practice steadily, and by 1886 she had a proper surgery set up in Dry Creek, a 2-room structure near the center of town that she operated formally, and that served the county's medical needs in a way that had previously required a 2-day ride to San Antonio. She had lobbied through her professional contacts for a proper pharmacy supply connection, and had gotten it, and the combination of reliable medical supplies and her own extensive practical knowledge made her, by any reasonable measure, the most significant medical presence in that corner of Texas. She had hired an assistant by 1886, a young woman named Constance Yates, who had come from Oklahoma with nursing experience she had acquired in a field hospital during a cholera outbreak, and who had the right combination of steadiness and quick learning that Pauline required in anyone working alongside her. Training Constance was one of the more satisfying ongoing projects of that period, the transmission of knowledge in the direction her father had aimed it, towards someone who could use it fully. Phineas continued to run the Underwood operation with the same deliberate competence that had built it, and the ranch prospered through the mid-1880s, surviving the hard winter of 1885 that devastated many operations in the region because Phineas had, characteristically, anticipated the possibility and prepared for it. The cowhands who stayed through that winter, which they all did because the Underwood operation was where you wanted to be when things were hard, remembered it as the winter that proved the quality of the ranch's leadership. The legal resolution of the Boggs situation had been completed in late 1884, and the county had moved past it as communities move past resolved conflicts, not forgetting entirely but no longer requiring it to be the active center of attention. Boggs himself had sold a significant portion of his land holdings to cover the legal costs and had retreated to a much reduced presence in the county, which was a natural consequence and a just one. Margaret, at 10 years old, had developed into a reader and a thinker who asked questions of everyone around her and synthesized the answers with an intellectual energy that frequently startled the adults she was interrogating. She had developed a particular interest in Pauline's medicine work, not from sentiment but from the same analytical drive that governed all her interests, and she spent time in the surgery in Dry Creek when she was old enough to travel there alone, watching Pauline work with the focused attention of a student who understood that learning required paying very close attention to someone who knew what they were doing. Frances remained Frances, which was to say she remained in full forward motion with unstoppable affection and enthusiastic opinion, and she had by 1886 appointed herself Edgar's primary guardian and entertainer, a role that Edgar, who was 2 and in possession of significant personality, received with great satisfaction. Pauline and Phineas found, in the way that busy people find, that the quieter moments of their marriage were often the most important ones. The evening porch time continued to be the location of their best conversations, and the conversations continued to range widely and to spark off each other in ways that neither could have sustained alone. He brought the ranch and its dynamics and its human questions. She brought the medicine and its cases, and the particular lens that knowing how bodies worked gave you on how people worked. Together, they covered a territory that was larger than either could have mapped separately. She loved him with a constancy that surprised her with its consistency. She had expected the early intensity of it to settle into something more routine, which was what she understood marriage to do based on the evidence available to her. But it did not settle in the direction of routine. It settled in the direction of depth, which was different, which was something that only became apparent with time rather than fading with it. She would look at him across the supper table, in the lamplight, 7 years after standing on the porch in the dark, and saying the thing that cracked everything open, and feel something that was entirely recognizable as love but was bigger than the word suggested, something that had accumulated layers the way the best things do. He was, she thought, on one of the evenings in 1889 when the children were in bed, and the ranch was quiet and they were sitting with their evening coffee, the person she would have designed if she had been asked to design the person she most needed. Not because he was perfect. He was not. He was stubborn in specific ways that required navigation, and he was not always good at receiving help when he needed it, and he sometimes stayed in his own head longer than was useful. But his imperfections were the kind you could work with rather than the kind you had to survive, and that distinction was everything. He caught her looking at him and raised an eyebrow, which was a question. She said, "I was thinking about the fact that you called me a hired hand to Amos Fielding." He had the grace to look genuinely pained. He said, "I have regretted that every day since it happened." She said, "You should, it was terrible." He said, "It was the least accurate thing I have said in my adult life." She said, "In your defense, I don't think either of us had a good word for what I was to this place at that point." He said, "I have better words now." She said, "What are they?" He said, leaning forward over the table with the gravity of someone speaking a truth that has been refined over years. "The person who made this place worth the work. The person who understood before I could say it what I needed. The best choice I ever made, and I have made some good choices." She said, "You are going to make me look at the ceiling." He said, "Look at the ceiling if you need to, it doesn't change the truth of it." She looked at the ceiling for a moment and then looked back at him and said, "I love you. It is still slightly alarming how much." He said, "Good. I would hate to be the only one alarmed. The second pregnancy had come in 1886 and had produced a girl they named Clara Margaret, which was Phineas's suggestion for the first name, offered carefully, and with the question of whether she minded, because he wanted to honor his first wife in a name without making Pauline carry a weight she hadn't asked for. Pauline had said that she did not mind at all, that Clara had been the mother of his daughters and the woman who had shaped the life she had stepped into, and that honoring her was the right thing. She said it without performance because she meant it, and he had looked at her with the expression she associated with moments where he found her more than he had known to expect. Clara Margaret was, from the beginning, a different creature from Edgar. Where Edgar was loud and forward and operated at a consistent high energy, Clara Margaret was quiet and observant and accomplished things by completely different routes that involved patience and the strategic placement of enormous charm. She was, in short, her father in small form, which Francis declared was the funniest possible outcome, and which Margaret analyzed as a fascinating case of transmitted character. By 1890, the Underwood Ranch was at a different scale and a different kind of establishment than it had been in 1882. It was, in the way of good operations, not flashy but deeply solid. The land was well managed. The herd was healthy. The people working on it were treated with a consistency that created loyalty, and that loyalty had carried the operation through the hard moments that come for everyone. Phineas had diversified in a careful way, adding a modest orchard and kitchen garden that Bertie managed with enormous satisfaction, and had invested in fencing improvements that reduced the labor of managing the herd's range. Pauline had, by 1890, trained 2 young women in basic nursing and first aid for the county's needs, reducing the dependence on her personally while expanding the network's capacity. She had written letters to medical contacts in larger cities, establishing connections that allowed her to stay current with developments in medicine that were beginning, in the late 1880s and early 1890s, to move very quickly. She had gotten her hands on journals from the Eastern medical establishment and read them with the focused attention of someone who understood that the field was changing and who intended to change with it. She had also, in 1889, done something she had not planned. A young woman from town, the daughter of a Mexican family that had been in the county since before anyone living remembered, had come to her in considerable distress because she had a gift for medicine and wanted to learn it properly and had nowhere to turn. Her name was Rosa Gutierrez, and she was 19 years old, and she was, within 3 months of working in Pauline's surgery, clearly one of those rare people who are simply built for a particular kind of work. Pauline taught her everything she was teaching Constance and several things she was not, and sponsored her correspondence with a women's medical college in Philadelphia that had recently expanded its admissions to include Western candidates. Rosa had gone to Philadelphia in 1891 with a letter of recommendation from Pauline that was 5 pages long and contained a level of professional advocacy that the admissions committee found both unusual and compelling. She had graduated 4 years later and returned to Texas to practice medicine, which was its own complete and remarkable story, but the beginning of it was in Pauline Sawyer's surgery in Dry Creek. And Pauline felt the rightness of that the way she felt the rightness of a clean suture or a fever breaking, the specific satisfaction of something that could not be argued with. The winter of 1891 brought a hard illness to the county, not as bad as the epidemic of 1878 that had taken Clara, but bad enough to require sustained and exhausting work. Pauline ran her surgery and made house calls and coordinated with Constance and the other women she had trained, and came home on several evenings so depleted that she ate supper and went directly to bed without her customary evening hour on the porch. Phineas, during those weeks, managed the household so completely that she did not have to think about it, which was a specific form of love that she recognized and received with gratitude. He got the children fed and into bed. He kept Bertie, who was 70 now and had limited capacity for extra work, from having to overextend. He had coffee ready when she came in and asked nothing of her and was simply present, which was, in the depleted state she was in, exactly right. When the illness wave passed in late February of 1892, she had come to the breakfast table one morning and looked at him and said, "How did you know that I needed you to just be there without needing anything from me?" he had said. "Because I know you. I have been paying attention for 10 years. She had said, 10 years. He had said, long enough to know that the way you ask for help is by not asking, and that the only way to give it is to be present without requiring it to be acknowledged. She had sat down slowly and put her coffee cup on the table and said, "You are a better person than most people know you are," he had said. "You made me better, that is the honest version," she had said. "That is not the honest version. You were already this person. I just stopped you from hiding it." He had almost argued with this and then decided not to, which was its own evidence of growth, and instead he had reached across and refilled her coffee cup without being asked. Edgar, by 1892, was 8 years old and had developed into a child of enormous physical energy and considerable kindness, the combination that Pauline considered the most hopeful possible in a boy of that age. He wanted to know everything about the ranch and everything about the medicine, which he accessed through following his mother and his father with equal devotion, and rotating his questions between them with the impartiality of a child who had decided both parents were equally authoritative sources. He had Pauline's directness and Phineas's particular kind of steadiness, and his grandfather Edgar Sawyer's inexhaustible curiosity, and the combination was something that Pauline, watching him argue with Margaret about the taxonomy of a beetle they had found near the barn, felt was one of the better things she had contributed to the world. Clara Margaret, at 6, had the manner of someone who was very quietly running everything, which was not untrue. She had her father's patience and her mother's analytical quality, and had organized the domestic arrangements of the children's part of the household to her complete satisfaction, which meant that Edgar and Francis, who were 12 years apart but similarly powered by enthusiasm, were channeled in directions Clara Margaret had identified as productive. Francis, who was 18 and deeply amused by her small half-sibling, recognized a kin spirit in the management quality and approved. Margaret had turned 18 in 1892 and was corresponding with a school in Austin that offered teacher training, which she had decided was the professional direction that made the most use of her particular combination of knowledge and patience. She was going to be an excellent teacher. She was going to be the kind of teacher who changed people's understanding of what they were capable of, which was the best kind. Pauline had told her this directly, one afternoon when they were sitting in the kitchen, and Margaret was working through a letter of intent she was writing, and Margaret had looked up with the expression of someone who had received information they were putting in a permanent place and said simply, "Thank you." The ranch in the spring of 1893 was green and large and busy with the particular productive energy of a well-run operation in a good season. Pauline stood at the fence of the north pasture one afternoon in May, watching the herd move across the new grass, and thought about the person who had arrived in Dry Creek 11 years earlier with a carpet bag and $47, and the kind of determination that has no more optimism in it than a stone wall, just the density of something that will not give way. She thought about the February night, and the calf, and the mud, and the lamp oil and the heifer's frightened breathing, and the particular satisfaction of the outcome. She thought about Diego's tooth and the 17 stitches in Clem Harker's arm, and all the other accumulated pieces of medical work that had built her place in this community. The pulled teeth, and the sutured wounds, and the delivered calves, and the fevers brought down, and the children born, and the older people helped through their final difficulties with something more than abandonment. She thought about Amos Fielding's greasy hat tip and the word hired hand, and how much had turned on that word, how the crack it made had let everything real come through. She heard boots on the dry grass behind her and did not turn because she knew those boots, had known them for a decade now, the particular weight and rhythm of them. Phineas came and stood beside her at the fence, looking out at the same pasture. He said after a comfortable silence, "What are you thinking?" she said. "About hired hands." He made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and the long vowel of genuine remorse. She said, "I am not still angry about it. I have not been angry about it for a very long time. I was thinking about it as the thing that started everything, the crack in the dam." He said, "I have thought about it that way too." She said, "If you had introduced me differently to Fielding, if you had said something else, something correct, something that named what I actually was to you, even if you couldn't say it yet in the personal way, I might not have said anything. I might have let the summer pass and gone on being careful and professional and leaving things unnamed." He said, "And," she said, "and we might have lost the whole thing. The fear of saying it might have won." He said, "Then I owe Amos Fielding an unexpected debt." She said, "Do not tell him that. He would find a way to monetize it." He laughed properly, not the almost smile but the real version, and it still did the thing it had always done, the dawn on a landscape thing, and she was still glad of it after all the time she had seen it. He said, "Are you happy?" She turned and looked at him directly, which was her way of indicating that what she was about to say was something she meant completely. She said, "Phineas, I have stitched wounds and pulled teeth and delivered calves and managed fevers, and done most of it in conditions that would discourage a reasonable person. I have done it in this county for 11 years, and I have built something here that matters and that will outlast me in Constance and in Rosa, and in the women I have trained. I have 2 children who are remarkable and 2 stepdaughters who are equally remarkable, and a husband who has never once, not in 10 years, made me feel like the word hired hand described me." She paused. He was watching her with the careful full attention that was his particular gift. She said, "I am the happiest I have been in my life. That is the accurate answer." He said, "Good," she said. "That is all you have, good." He said with the gravity of a man offering something considered, "It is good in a way that does not have a larger word. It is the most complete kind of good, and I am exactly as happy if that is what you were also asking." She said, "It was what I was also asking." He said, "Then good covers both of us." She turned back to the pasture and they stood together in the May afternoon watching the herd on the new grass. And the sky above that corner of Texas was the unreasonable blue it got in spring, a blue that seemed to be working at something. And the air smelled of warm earth and grass and the particular clean smell of cattle country in a good season. And Pauline Sawyer Underwood stood with her shoulder against her husband's arm and thought that this, precisely this, was what she had been building toward through all the years that had not looked like building, all the years that had looked like surviving. She had survived them, and on the other side of surviving, this was what waited. It was more than she had known to ask for. It was exactly enough. Later that summer, in July of 1893, there was one more thing. She had been working late in her surgery in Dry Creek, when a knock on the door admitted a woman she had not seen before. A woman perhaps 5 years younger than herself, traveling through the county with a wagon and a sick child, and no money, and a look in her eyes that Pauline recognized immediately as the look of someone who has been managing an impossible situation alone for too long, and is now at the precise edge of where alone is able to take them. The child, a boy of about 4, had a respiratory infection that was serious but treatable. Pauline had treated it with the attention and thoroughness she brought to every case regardless of the patient's capacity to pay, which was a policy she had maintained from the beginning, because it was what her father had done, and because it was right. She had also, while the child slept under the influence of a careful dose of syrup she had compounded herself, talked to the woman, whose name was Helen Brower, and learned that she was moving west from Missouri, widowed 8 months prior, trying to reach a sister in New Mexico territory. She had no money left and her wagon needed a wheel repair, and she had not eaten properly in 3 days. Pauline had given her food from the surgery's small stock. She had sent Constance to fetch the man in town who repaired wagon wheels and had paid for the repair herself. She had packed medicine for the boy's continuing treatment with instructions written clearly in large letters, and had given Helen Brower a letter of introduction to a woman she knew in El Paso, who had connections to the network of practical women that existed across the West in that period. Women who helped each other across distances, with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that official systems frequently failed them. Helen Brower had stood at the surgery door with her recovering boy on her hip and looked at Pauline with the expression of someone who has received something they did not know they needed until it arrived and said, "How do I repay you?" Pauline had said. "You don't repay me. If you have the opportunity somewhere down the road to help someone who is exactly where you are right now, you do that instead. That is how the repayment goes." Helen Brower had nodded with the gravity of someone receiving instruction, and had gone out to her repaired wagon and driven west toward New Mexico. And Pauline had stood in the surgery door watching the wagon diminish down the main street of Dry Creek, and felt the full circle of something. The chain of capable women helping each other across distance and difficulty, and the particular loneliness of being capable in a world that would prefer you were something smaller. She rode back to the ranch in the long summer evening, the sky going orange and purple in that spectacular western way, the road familiar and comfortable under her horse's hooves. She could see the lights of the ranch house when she came over the last rise, warm and specific in the dusk. Phineas was on the porch. She could see the shape of him as she brought her horse into the yard. Edgar, who had somehow detected her arrival with the inexplicable sonar of children, was out of the house and running across the yard before she was fully dismounted, announcing that there was supper, and that it was good, and that Clara Margaret had organized the setting of the table with modifications he considered unnecessary but had accepted. She caught Edgar and held him for a moment, this solid, warm child who had her father's name and her husband's steadiness and his own considerable version of both, and looked over his head at Phineas coming down off the porch toward her, moving through the summer dusk with the unhurried quality that was simply how he moved through the world, and she thought, "I am home. Not the building, not the land. Him and this and all of it together." She thought of all the miles between the woman who had arrived in Dry Creek with $47 and the woman who stood now in this yard at this moment. All the wounds stitched and teeth pulled and calves delivered. All the dark past navigated and the forbidden feelings finally named and the forced choices finally replaced with free ones. All the secrets turned into open truths. All the ultimate sacrifices of the smaller version of herself that had been necessary to become this larger one. She thought, "Papa, you would have liked him," and she thought he would have known that without being told. Edgar pulled her toward the house and she went, and Phineas met her at the porch steps and put his hand on her back as she went up, the way he always did, the small, ordinary gesture that was one of the daily accumulations of being known and steady in a world that frequently offered neither. She put her hand over his for a moment briefly, and he pressed it briefly, and they went inside to supper, to the lamplight and the noise of their children and Bertie's good food and Margaret's informed opinions and Francis's enthusiastic accounts of the day, and all of it was alive and specific and entirely theirs. Outside, the Texas night settled over the ranch with its enormous stars, the same stars that had been there the first night on the porch, the same stars that would be there long after all of this, and they went on being enormous and indifferent and magnificent the way they always had. And below them, in the warm lit house on the Underwood ranch in Dry Creek, Texas in the summer of 1893, Pauline Sawyer Underwood sat at the head of the table that had once been a table she had been invited to. And she was home, and it was real, and there was nothing left open that was not worth leaving open to the future, which spread out ahead of them like the good country it was going to be.